All right, everybody, welcome back to class. Welcome to our new unit. This is the unit in the biblical apocalypse, which will primarily focus on our reading of the book of Revelation from the Bible. Uh, Remember to watch this whole video and put a comment in this YouTube video so I can see you participating. Make it a nice comment. We do have to be somewhat sensitive, of course, because we are studying something that is thought of as holy scripture to many people, and we want to be sensitive to that. So we are going to be primarily reading the book of Revelation in our biblical apocalypse unit. However, the book of Revelation is the very last book of the Bible. So I think it's necessary, if we're going to read the last book of the Bible, that I give you a little bit of a highlights reel of what came before that, meaning what happened in the entire Bible. I'm obviously not going to summarize the whole thing, but I wanted to show you some stuff that I think will be good for you to know when you get to Revelation. There's some stuff it's going to be referring to, and you'll want to know about it. So let's talk about it. First of all, before I start going into the whole slideshow here, it's good for you to know that the Holy Bible is, at least the one shown here, which is the Christian Bible, is made up of two parts called the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, the Old Testament is the story of the ancient Israelites and Jewish people in the beginning of the Jewish religion. Now, Christianity is started as a sect of Judaism, as an offshoot from Judaism. And so both the Jewish people and Christians find the Old Testament to be Holy Scripture. They view it as Holy Scripture, so it's shared by two religions. The New Testament, however, is just thought of as Holy Scripture by Christians. It begins with the appearance of Jesus Christ. And then it continues with stories about his life, stories about the very beginnings of the Christian church, lots of letters back and forth kind of explaining what Christianity is. Then it ends with this strange and mysterious book, the book of Revelation, which we are going to be reading, which talks about, in a lot of ways, the end of the world. So I want to go through some of the highlights so that you know some information that will be important for you while you're reading Revelation, because they'll be making a lot of references back to earlier things from the Bible, both New Testament and Old Testament. All right, well, let's start at the very beginning, the beginning of all time, in creation. Well, the very beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, it talks about God creating the universe and the world and humans. And it takes him all of 6 days to create all of this. The seventh day, he rested. So putting that all together, you get what's referred to as the 7 days of creation. Now, not all people think this is a literal 7 days. Some people do. Some people think that's more of a metaphor, but we don't really have to worry about that. We just have to know that this is what the book of Revelation might be referencing back to anytime it uses the number 7. Book of Revelation is very into using numbers as symbols. So 7 here usually represents the idea of completion or the idea of perfection. It's kind of like it's God's number. I was going to show you this cool creation story clip from the movie Noah, but it doesn't really work in a screencast, so that's a bummer. We'll keep going. All right, let's talk about Abraham. So God created the world, and a lot of stuff happened. You had Adam and Eve in the garden, and then you have them getting kicked out of the garden because they sinned, and then you have stories of their kids, and you have stories about people doing weird stuff, and God finally says, you know, I need to have a people that like I can tell them who I am and they can follow me. So I'm going to start with this one guy, and he'll be the really the forefather of all of my people, and his name is Abraham. And he picks this guy, Abraham. So the big thing that Abraham did with God was he made a covenant with God where he says, I will follow you, you will be my God. And in exchange for that, God said, you will have many descendants, you will have children, and they will be my people, and they will multiply all over the earth. So Abraham had a son named Isaac, and then Isaac had two sons named Jacob and Esau. But all we care about right now is Jacob. Jacob was kind of a trickster guy. He had a long and interesting life of adventures. But one specific part that is interesting to us is he had a moment where he wrestled the angel of God. It was kind of like he wrestled God himself. And they wrestled all night. And then finally, God just touched Jacob's hip and made his leg go out of socket, and they beat him, which I always thought was kind of like a cheap move. You'd think that God could just win because he was stronger, he was God, but maybe he was just trying to make a point. Anyway, God says to Jacob, hey, I'm going to give you a new name. Your name is going to be Israel. And Israel, if you translate it, means struggles with God, just like Jacob did when he was wrestling this angel here. Now, what does Jacob do? Jacob goes and he has 12 sons. Yes. Were they all the same wife? They weren't. Things were a little weird back then. We can talk about that some other time, but we have the 12 sons of Jacob. Once this becomes like a whole people, the sons of Israel, the Israelites, then they'll be called the tribes of Israel, because each tribe will say which of these sons they were descended from. So we got, some normal names like Reuben, Simeon's not too strange, Levi. You might see a Judah once in a while. Definitely see a Dan. But how many Naphtali's do you know? You know how many Gads or Ashers, Issachars or Zebulons? And then we have Joseph. That's pretty normal. And Benjamin too. But do you notice anything different about these guys? I don't know. If you're able to kind of look closely at your screen, Joseph looks different than all of these guys. They all have their kind of robes on, but Joseph's sitting in a big throne with some headpiece on. Well, the reason for that is because Joseph was the favorite son of Israel. Jacob/Israel loved Joseph, and he once famously gave him a multicolored coat and made him feel like he was better than all of his other brothers. Joseph was also really good at interpreting dreams, knowing what dreams meant. One time he had a dream where a bunch of stalks of corn bowed down to another stalk of corn. I think it was 11 stalks of corn bowed down to the 12th, and he interpreted that, and he goes, hey, brothers, guess what? All of you are going to bow down to me. That's what my dream means. So these guys didn't like Joseph that much, and they ended up throwing him into a ditch and selling him into slavery. You might say that's a bit of an overreaction. I would agree with you. Kind of a jerk move. But what happens? Well, eventually, Joseph gets his way into Egypt. And then, because he's so good at interpreting dreams and he's such a smart guy, he ends up getting promoted all the way to the vizier, which is the second in command to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. So he's like about as high up as you can get in the Egyptian government without being the Pharaoh himself. And he's kind of ruling the entire country. And then there's a big famine everywhere except for Egypt, because Joseph was able to help them prepare for it. And all of his brothers were out there outside of Egypt, and they're starving in the famine. And so they all came to Egypt and asked for help, and Joseph messed with them a bit because they didn't know it was him, because now he's a big shot in Egypt. And he kind of jokes with them and pretends that they stole something from him. They think they're going to get put to death. He has a good laugh, and eventually he forgives them, and they all move to Egypt. And then many years after, all of these people multiply until you have a lot of Israelites in Egypt, and then you start having pharaohs that don't like them, and they put them into slavery. And if you don't know anything, you know that eventually they have to get led out of Egypt by Moses. Here's Moses from the movie Ten Commandments leading them through the Red Sea. He gets them out of Egypt. And if you want to remember how he does that, well, one way is he has a bunch of plagues come. God, through Moses, sends a bunch of plagues to Egypt to convince Pharaoh to let them go. And the last plague is the most serious one, the one that has the most effective one, which is God sends kind of the angel of death throughout Egypt and kills the firstborn son of every family. And the way that the Israelites escaped this happening was they followed some directions from God. They killed a lamb and they ate it and put its blood on their doorways. And whenever the angel of death or God would go by and see the blood on the doorways, they wouldn't kill the firstborn son of that family. So the reason I bring all this up is because the sacrificed lamb and the blood of the lamb ends up becoming a heavy symbol in the book of Revelation. I'll come back to the idea of the sacrificial lamb again. Anyway, Moses leads them out of Egypt, and they eventually, after a long time, I'm skipping a lot, they end up setting up their own kingdom in Israel. Right here you have a temple. King Solomon eventually builds a temple to God where people can worship God. And they have very specific ways they're supposed to do it. One way that they worship God is, they are still sinners, just like Adam and Eve were when they rebelled against God. They have to somehow get God to forgive them and make atonement for their sins. One way is that they make animal sacrifices. What kind of animals they sacrifice? They sacrifice many different ones, but one of them is the sacrificial lamb. They might sacrifice a lamb, and that gets them to atone for their sins. They've sacrificed something, so God can say, okay, if you're willing to sacrifice that, I guess I'll forgive you. And the lamb is one of them. Now, that's going to be really important when we read the book of Revelation. So just remember, the sacrificial lamb is what saves people from their sins and their separation from God. All right. Eventually, though, the kingdom of Israel gets taken over. By who? Well, by lots of different places, but the big one is the nation of Babylon, the empire of Babylon. And you get this period called the Babylonian captivity, which means the Israelites were captives under Babylonian rule. This is really important to remember this term Babylon. Babylon becomes a symbol for an oppressive power that has taken over God's people and is oppressing God's people. You're going to hear this term Babylon used to talk about another ruling power that has God's people in captivity during the time of Revelation. Now, this thing of people under the captivity of an oppressive power is when you first get apocalyptic writing in the Bible. These are going to be books like Daniel and Ezekiel, where they will look at prophecies regarding how they're going to get out of this captivity, how God is going to show his power and his wrath. And that's what you get apocalyptic writing. They're going, God, where are you? And we get that revelation. Remember, that's what apocalypse means, of God's true plans and intentions while they are there suffering through captivity. So this is very important because it connects the ancient Hebrew writing tradition of apocalyptic writing to the book of Revelation, which is following in that same genre and tradition of writing. Well, the nation of Israel is pretty much still in captivity, and then finally you get, in the New Testament, the arrival of Jesus. Here he is, riding on a donkey. Now, this still takes place under a time of captivity. I'm going to let you think there for a second. Does anybody know who the Jewish people are captives to a certain degree at this time? Well, it's no longer Babylon. Now it is Rome. When Jesus shows up, they are under Roman occupation. And a lot of people thought Jesus would be a political leader that would rise up against Rome and somehow get, Jewish independence, because Jesus was a Jewish man. All his followers were Jewish, and he was proclaiming new truths about the Jewish God and his relationship to him. Well, eventually, many of you know that Jesus was put to death and crucified. And when he was crucified, the Christians believe that he died in sacrifice for everybody else, much like that sacrificial lamb that would atone for other people's sins, taking the place of their sins. Jesus was the sacrifice for everyone for all time. And he was crucified and he died, but then 3 days later, he was resurrected. 3 is another important number in the Bible because he was resurrected 3 days later. There's 3 people in the Trinity. 3 is an important number. Then he ascends into heaven, but he says, I'm coming back. I'm alive and I'm coming back, and then I'm going to really settle things and usher in the end of the world. And so that's where the Christian church is, waiting for Jesus to come back. And this is my funny little picture of Terminator Jesus. These people have to figure out what to do in the Christian church. They say, hey, this Jesus guy that we followed, he died. Then we hear that he rose again, and now he's gone away. What are we going to do? So they have to figure it out, and they start this new religion called Christianity. But the problem is that, they say we only worship God and Jesus is God, and that's complicated, but we worship them, and that's the only people we owe any allegiance to. And Rome's like, hey, you guys should worship our emperors too and do what we say. And they go, no, we don't really want to do that. So what ends up happening is you get this persecution of Christians under the Romans. There's Roman persecution. So just like Babylon, for the Israelites, the Christians have Rome. They're being persecuted. They're getting killed for what they believe in, and they're under a lot of oppression and prejudice due to their faith. And this is the world that exists when the book of Revelation is written. The book of Revelation is written by a Christian man who at the time was exiled. We learned this from the first chapter of Revelation, on the island of Patmos, which is in one of these islands in between Turkey and Greece. And he sends this letter called Revelation to 7 churches. And here are the 7 churches, all in Asia Minor and modern-day Turkey. He sends them to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, where we get our American Philadelphia, and Laodicea. So he sends this book of Revelation out, and it's a message about God's truth and power during this time of Roman occupation, just like the apocalyptic writing from the Old Testament was about how Babylon had conquered Israel. Now, who is this guy that wrote it? His name is John. He says, my name is John. You can call him John the Revelator because it sounds cool, and also means the guy that wrote Revelation. But who is he? There's a lot of controversy about this. At first, a lot of people thought that it was the same guy known as the Apostle John. The Apostle John was a disciple of Christ. That means he was one of Jesus' actual friends and followers. He sometimes calls himself the loved disciple, the one that Jesus loved. Like he was best friends with Jesus. And most people believe that the disciple John is the same person that wrote the Gospel of John, one of the 4 Gospels that tells the story about Jesus, and the 3 epistles or letters of John that are in the New Testament. So some people think he is also the author of the book of Revelation. Scholars debate this. I would say most scholars seem to think it's a different guy, but you never know. Usually they say it's a different guy because just the way it was written is written a lot different than these other things that are attributed to John. So what are some other views? Well, that he's just some early Christian that's writing this apocalypse in the style of the old Jewish apocalypses, and he's writing them to the churches. Some people think he was even a participant in the Jewish rebellion against Rome. He was a Christian of Jewish descent who rebelled against Rome, and that's why maybe he has been exiled to this island of Patmos. No matter what, he does not like Rome. He's going to be tearing it down as like the devil and the horrible, evil oppressor of Christians. So that's kind of giving you some ideas about where this book of Revelation comes into the Bible and what the background is. Hopefully this will give you a little bit of information as you read it and understanding it, but I'll talk about it with you as well. All right, guys, that's it for now. Don't forget to leave a little comment in the YouTube so that I know that you read it. Or, sorry, that you watched it. All right, talk to you soon.